I'm ready.
Okay, it's an honor to welcome Or Yissachar to this podcast. He is the head of the research department at the Israel's Defense and Security Forum. How are you today, Or? Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Chung. Thanks for having me.
Yes. We'll be focusing much of our discussion on the Israeli Defense Forces, or the IDF. Uh, but first, I'd like to hear about the Israel's Defense and Security Forum. What do you guys do there?
Yeah, so the forum was established 4 years ago by Brigadier General Amir Avivi and a group of other senior officers with a clear goal in mind, a big question called how to secure Israel for generations to come. And keeping Israel safe, the security, national security of the state of Israel is not obvious. It's the Jewish people has been exiled for 2,000 years. It has been forced at least 4 times to go to exile from its homeland. We saw the terrible Holocaust in Europe and the abuse and deportations from Arab countries, including my own ancestors. And really, what we felt is that the Israeli defense establishment and the general discourse in Israel is not really in the direction that we were hoping for. And the discussion has become very technical and not national, and they lack the Zionist values and the belief in the righteousness of the cause that really lacked so much in our eyes. And what other thing was really different is that it's a movement and not like a closed exclusive club of elite senior officers. And it also includes people from the Shin Bet, Mossad, police, and also just ordinary citizens, even pre-military program youth who are 18, 19-year-olds, or even students who don't who just, went to the military like anyone else, but they are feeling sympathy with the values that we represent. And we do represent a voice that echoes a large part of Israeli society. We already count over 30,000 members and counting. We have a great research department. I have the honor to lead. We have great researchers, social media, original video productions. So all these things combined allow us to speak with both Israeli public and decision makers. We go to Congress, we go to the European Parliament, foreign embassies in Israel as well, and representing Israeli interests in front of the world.
Wonderful. So I first met you at a conference held by
Right.
the Danube Institute in Budapest,
Yeah, I remember
Hungary.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I was hoping we could spend a few minutes on that because it was a rather chaotic conference, to say
Mhm.
the least. I believe the topic was sexual violence committed by Hamas and their
Right.
sympathizers in Gaza against Israeli women. And I remember like almost half of the people who were there were hoping to protest or agitate against the event. I suppose they were more sympathetic to Hamas or the Palestinian cause, but they were very intense in their protestations. I was hoping to hear
Mhm.
your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you always see it on TV and on social media, and you think these people obviously have something wrong in them because they obviously are very speak with maximum confidence on topics they have really clearly are not great experts on. But I wasn't expecting that because I was expecting a nice academic conference. I already visited the Danube Institute back in November. There was nothing of the sort. Got to tell you, first of all, that the Danube Institute itself was also shocked by what happened there and apologized 10 times and was committed that the event does not happen again. And indeed, it never happened in Hungary before. That's why they weren't expecting it at all. Many of the protesters came from outside of Hungary, probably from Vienna, foreign students, and I believe none of whom was Hungarian. And you see the Hungarians in the room who are outraged and telling them to leave because I was kidding and I told them it's an adult conference and you children are interrupting because they clearly are not in understanding of how a civil debate works. They didn't come to engage in dialogue. They came obviously to disrupt. They came, ready with phones and to, take video shooting of these and upload to social media and be great heroes. And I think it just reflects, the big ignorance in the West today about what's going on in Israel. Anyone is an expert on the Middle East. And I think they are not acting in a vacuum. That's why when the Israeli ambassador was rushed out by the security guards, while those lunatics were crying out loud, free Palestine and you're murdering Palestinian children, as if, the IDF just walks into Gaza and murders Palestinian children for the joy of it, because that's what we do, Israelis, right? That's who we are. And you're trying to engage in a serious debate. And at one point, I told one of the protesters, I want to, because he said, how many Palestinians you killed? And I said, I want to respect your question. So if you want to sit down, because there are 20 other people here, you're not alone. And they obviously were not aware that of the rules how to behave in a civilized society. But also, I think it touches upon a much deeper point, because everything you see on social media, the riots in campuses, really does reflect that the Western youth is not willing to engage in fighting. It is reflective of, in some cases, sick parts of society who are tired. They reflect what Douglas Murray called the fatigue, the Western tiredness of being, the self-flagellation, the belief that everybody else is virtuous and the world is graded by, a hierarchy of classes and races. Candidates in U.S. election that accuse, straight white men because of the fact that they lost in the race, not because they were poor candidates. All these things really touch upon a very, very deep point, that they are not willing to fight in a war, and they would appease the aggressor, the bully, the enemy, which is the Russian and China and Iran and Hamas and all the terrorist organizations in the world, and terror sponsor and state sponsor of terrorism. They want to appease them. Now, there is one exception to this rule, which is Russia, and I think one of the main reasons I kind of smiled when I look at it, because they on one hand fight on behalf of Ukraine against the illegal Russian invasion of the country, and I'm fully supportive of that. On the contrary, they fail to realize and to fail to appreciate that Israel is fighting exactly the same war. It's the West's war against the aggressors, and I think they were just educated on, in Israel we say, you put you on a trail on the train tracks and they let you roll. It's like, you don't have a independent thinking anymore. So the interpretive framework, as I call it, really sets a very clear and very mundane picture for them. Israel is bad. It murders Palestinians. There is genocide in Gaza, starvation, occupation. It must stop. If we oppose Israel, if we are for Palestinians, we are on the right side of history. That is all wrong, but they seem to believe it's all right because of the cloud of hot steam that is around the air. On social media, you see fake images of Gaza and fake figures of the number of casualties by the Gaza Health Ministry, is promoted by some European media outlets and by the United Nations. All these things create a hysteria. So people don't have to be experts. They just follow the herd. And I think that's really disturbing, really a deeper point about where, the Western society goes from here.
Mhm. Yes. I spent a substantial amount of this podcast as well as in my life as a student and academic to deal with these sort of like raging campus left. So yeah, everything you say, you're preaching to the choir. Um, Nevertheless, so there's a bit of good news coming from the Israel-Hamas war in the past weekend. 4 hostages have been returned to their families. Yeah, God be blessed. But something disturbing also came from that, as in, I found out that there are a substantial amount of Gazan residents who, despite not being involved in the combat process at all, were actively involved in the sheltering and holding of Israeli hostages. So they may be civilians, but they're not innocent. So what do you suppose the IDF's treatment for these particular kinds of civilians would be?
I think it really shows you who we're up against. Okay. There are 2 million people in Gaza. Okay. Hamas didn't just emerge out of thin air. It's an organic group, an authentic group. It's not Fatah and the PLO of Yasser Arafat, who came from Tunisia and Jordan and Turkey and other places, who have nothing to do with the Palestinians who live there. Maybe they do at some point, but definitely they were a leadership, if you can call them that, a group of arch terrorists who were so-called landed from overseas and imposed on a Palestinian population. In fact, 2/3 of Palestinians in the Oslo Accords in 1993 that Israel struck with Yasser Arafat and gave up a huge amount of territory, it was premised on the on the assumption that the Palestinians want Yasser Arafat as their leader, while two-thirds of them didn't want him. They wanted the Jordanian king or local leadership. So, and reading Ephraim Karsh, the Oslo disaster really proves it. We also, in the IDSF research department, issued a great, I mean, quite a bit a thick a publication called The Oslo Debacle, 30 Years to the Accords That Changed Israel. So bottom line is that most of the Palestinian population supports Hamas's October 7 massacre. There is no way to deny it. People create this artificial distinguishment between the Palestinian population and Hamas, while 75% of them, according to all polls, support the October 7 massacre. Now, I'll ask you something else. Abdallah al-Jamal, he was an Al Jazeera journalist
Yes, yes, I
who was
know.
concealing, right? He was concealing and hiding this Israeli hostage called Noah Argamani in his home. And he was helped by, I believe, his brother or cousin or somebody else, also called Jamal, a doctor. So these were not Hamas members per se. They were paid for by Hamas in order to keep the hostages. The 40,000 some troops that Hamas counts, they didn't land from, they're not little Martian men. They were Palestinians who were raised in the Gaza Strip. And after generations of brainwashing, I reminding you, started also already in the days of the PLO and early 90s, and on in the 2007 Hamas coup d'etat in Gaza. And generations were brainwashed to hate Jews. I read their manuscript. I was shocked to see how they teach physics by a rogatka, a straight stone throwing game to kill soldiers, and how they teach the alphabet and grammar rules by the verb istishhad or shahada, right, becoming a martyr. And all these things really do, and of course, the entire land of Israel, not this 1967 borders that the European Union is telling you. The entire land of Israel is so-called Palestine. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's what they're telling you. But there's something deeper than that, because the entire international community pretty much tells Israel not to kill so many innocent civilians in Gaza. I know it's relying on fake Hamas figures. We can talk about that. But then, if you remember, I'm sure you remember the story of Anne Frank, right, in the
Of
Holocaust.
course. Yeah.
The Jewish girl who, alongside her family, was hidden in an attic in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, during the Nazi occupation, and they were hidden by Miep Gies and others who were deeply involved in saving Jewish people. So, in the Yad Vashem, the present-day Israeli memorial for the Holocaust, they call them the righteousness among the nations, right? The righteous among the nations, non-Jewish people who were willing to risk their lives and save Jewish people during the Holocaust. Do you know one Palestinian Miep Gies? Not one. I mean, how come all this civilian population was concealing these hostages illegally and under great torture? They were not in Hamas tunnels where nobody saw them. They were within thousands of civilians, and everybody knew. And you come to realize that the population is colluding. It is complicit. It is not a legitimate target, but it is also colluding with Hamas. And that's, I think, people should not forget.
Mhm. Okay. Now, I would like to address your concerns regarding the figures that are being propagated. I believe the popular one being what, 30,000? 30,000 Palestinians have
35.
been, well,
Keep changing every day.
yes, of course. You've said that the numbers coming from the Gazan Health Ministry are not to be trusted because they are tied with Hamas. So, what figures should we trust then?
Well, I think to address this challenge, because there is a big, fog of war, and we have no idea really what the kind of casualties there are. The IDF is actually keeping track. And according to the IDF, some 14,000 militants were killed, and the number of civilians was not published. But I'm assuming these are, handful of thousands, who are a couple thousand civilians who were killed in Gaza. They were not targets. They were either used by Hamas as human shields. They happened to be around combat area. They refused to evacuate after being told to evacuate. Multiple times the IDF set, while risking soldier lives, set tent cities in around Khan Yunis and in the Mawasi area and in southern Gaza, tent cities with 500 trucks per day carrying humanitarian aid. I mean, all the conditions were there. Many of these Palestinians had cars. They could just take in a car and leave. There were safe corridors, including the Salah ad-Din route in the middle of Gaza. IDF tanks, and this is where, I think Israeli Hasbara or advocacy should definitely echo these pictures much more of IDF tanks and soldiers safeguarding Palestinian civilians as they are evacuating through these humanitarian corridors, while Hamas, and you can see it in satellite images and drone images, um, shoots these civilians with snipers, aims at these civilians, setting up roadblocks to block their way, threatening them. The Hamas Ministry of Communication issued a communication saying, you shouldn't leave. This is the second Nakba. You must never leave and obey the army of occupation, all these things. Um, so they say 35,000 were killed. And then the UN OCHA, which is the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, it's a very fancy name of saying the Office of Cooperation with Hamas in the United Nations, really is touting these figures. And you can go to OCHA right now and see how it looks amazing with all the figures and all the data and all the graphs. It is propaganda. And I'm shocked at the United Nations. And then as a result, many civil society organizations, NGOs, and world leaders, you see how the U.S. Minister of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is asked how many Palestinians will die in Gaza, and he says 35,000. And I'm shocked. I see how Western media outlets just keeping touting these numbers. And then when I ask an MEP, member of the European Parliament, how come you use these numbers? Well, that's the only numbers that we have. And so, okay, we'll use ISIS numbers, we'll use Al Qaeda numbers, and so this we tend to think that Hamas is less intelligent than we believe. They're very intelligent. They know what kind of sentiments to pluck and where to tap into Western feelings of women and children. There are no militants who died in Gaza, only women and children, and all these things. You saw the journalist. He was also a civilian per se, right? But he was a criminal. He watched over the hostages. Is he a civilian as well? So uh, Israelis tend to complain about what's going on in the world. I'm just finished with that we actually took gloves off and we established a website called warinisrael.org. Okay, warinisrael.org, where we concentrate all the data, all the statistics, all the real data about the war, how many were killed and how many rockets and how many attacks by Iranian forces on US bases, and stories on soldiers, heroic soldiers, and analysis of our research department on the war. So I very much recommend it. I think you can only fight lies with the unvarnished truth.
Yes. You know, I've heard an analogy said by the great William F. Buckley Jr. that if person A pushes an old lady towards traffic and person B pushes the old lady away from traffic, then people who commit the moral equivalence fallacy would say that, well, both men pushes old ladies around. So
Yeah.
it's very apt when you apply that to the situation between Israel and Hamas. The way I see it from my standpoint is that the IDF is doing its utmost possible to adhere to humanitarian standards as well as defending the people of Israel. And Hamas is, well, doing neither. But they are attuned to the cries of human rights violations and protection across the world, and they use that against the IDF. So you've already mentioned the fact that the IDF has applied rigorous humanitarian standards when it comes to well, both protecting the citizens of Israel as well as the Gazans. Now, one potential, I guess, counterpoint that I can raise is that, well, there are multiple videos of IDF soldiers abusing Gazan residents and Palestinian women and so on and so on, so forth. Do you attest to the validity of these video clips at all?
So that's why I call cherry picking. The real question is, any military has irregularities. Question is, one, how common is it? And second of all, how grave is it in comparison to other armies? Because you don't act in a laboratory, right? You don't act in a vacuum. You always compare yourself to other case studies. When they tell you, for example, there's a disproportionate amount of civilian casualties, well, you ask yourself, disproportionate to what? The United States in Mosul? I don't think so. There were far more civilian casualties. The World War II, 80% were civilian. What are you talking about? And so Israel is trying to do the impossible. I'm reminding you, October 7 happened. We all woke up with the sirens. Hamas terrorists invaded alongside with thousands, never forget that, thousands of Gaza civilians who invaded as well and raped and killed and tortured and were um, um, really stealing things and intimidating, hijacking civilians, really kidnapping them as well, as we said. So we tend to do this artificial distinguishment between Hamas and the civilian population. I'm not saying civilians who are not all holding arms are a target. I'm just saying let's be a little less innocent. But again, if you have one, two, three videos of IDF soldiers abusing Hamas terrorists who were arrested, I don't think anyone in Israel was feeling a lot of pity to see these images of these terrorists who participated on October 7 and in the attacks and have a lot of blood on their hands. Honestly, if there are irregularities, again, let's not cherry pick. The IDF prosecution, I think, prosecuted over 70 cases since the beginning of the war of soldiers who committed all sorts of things not according to orders, because at the end of the day, they're not supposed to do this. They're supposed to follow orders. And if 99.9% of them do it, and then a handful of people upload videos to YouTube or to Instagram or TikTok, and then some sort of Western media outlet catches upon that and sort of paints an entire picture as the entire IDF works like that. I'm an IDF reservist, and I don't do that. So I think most people that I know don't do it. So I think it's just, reaching the conclusion first and then backfilling it with evidence. Of course, Israel is bad. They've been telling us for years it is committing genocide and occupation, and it's starving Palestinians as a weapon of war. And it's doing all these great things that nobody can explain why they're doing. They're just evil. That's why they do it. And I think in this sense, it is really attempting to draw really to draw the dartboard around the arrow, in my opinion. I think any war has irregularities. I just think that these things are not reflective of the immense bravery and courage that these combatants are fighting, and they're fighting a vicious enemy, and we must never forget that.
Okay. Now, another concern that can be raised is you've already addressed, Israel is quote unquote starving the Gazans. So to what extent has Israel and the IDF allowed for humanitarian aid to enter Gaza?
Yeah, we actually lay it all in the warinisrael.org database, the Israel War Portal. And ever since the beginning of the war, in COGAT, the Israeli authority that deals with it, is publishing daily stats, and it's online and it's free, and you can look it up right now. I think Israel has been letting a few hundreds of trucks in the beginning, and now it already succeeded or passed 500 trucks per day of carrying humanitarian aid, in addition to the port that is right now built with over $300 million of US taxpayer money. The IDF is now operating it, and airborne equipment and humanitarian aid and lunches that are dropped by US and Jordanian airlift. So I think in that regard, if Hamas is stealing some of the humanitarian aid, that's a different story. But Israel, I think, is doing the utmost effort to make sure that civilians in Gaza don't suffer the cause of war, the consequences of war. But I think it's so hypocritical that the same countries who are mercilessly targeting their enemies are preaching Israel. And that's why many Israelis feel like Class B citizens, because Americans are allowed to do it, and French are allowed to do it, and the Russians are allowed to do it, and British are allowed to do it. But when Israel is fighting for its life and takes the utmost efforts to avoid civilian casualties, so they start propagating falsehoods like the number of deaths and like because they don't want to see the Gaza headlines anymore. They want to focus on their election and on agriculture and climate change. Israel is just standing in their way, and it's very obvious. I mean, it's the same double standard, really. I mean, it's the same standard for Ukraine, where Joseph Borrell says we have to arm Ukraine. There is nothing short of victory in this war. We cannot appease Putin. We must boost our billions and billions of aid to Ukraine and arms support, and I fully support that. But then again, he looks at the exact same situation in Israel, and he starts tarnishing it and propagating disinformation. The same Joseph Borrell who accused others of propagating disinformation. So this is really not. This is simply a simple factual issue. I'll just give you another short example. Last week there were big headlines that Israeli airstrike killed 35 Palestinians in an UNRWA school in Gaza. And then it dragged outrage by senior world leaders who are saying that they do not accept that and they are outraged and there is no safe zone in Gaza and all the talking points. And then apparently the IDF did, strike an UNRWA school in Gaza. There were not 35 fatalities, there were 17, and they were all Hamas militants hiding in this place. So when civilians leave and Hamas takes over, it becomes concrete. It becomes just stones. It's not a school anymore, it's a military compound. And according to any international law, that's the case, where you have a reasonable cause to believe that they are using it for military purposes. Then it becomes a legitimate military target. This is international humanitarian law, and there are some people trying to rewrite it because to sort of dress it up on Israel's sizes and stitch to Israel's measures. But where is the number 35 from? From the Gaza Ministry of Health. This is Hamas. And so you ask yourself, serious people are falling for this? Page 1 in the terrorist manual? And they do, not because they're silly, because they want to fall in this trap, because it's good headlines, because it's clickbaits, because it advances their narrative. They don't want to see Gaza again in the headlines. So this is really what it's all about, and it comes on our expense. We just want to finish the war, get the hostages back, win over Hamas, and assure that there is no more threat emanating from Gaza ever again. It's not so much to ask.
Yes. Later in the same month, I think there was also a conference at the Danube Institute regarding rule of law as lawfare. So there were many topics being discussed, but one of it being that this appeal to international law and international humanitarian standards against Israel during this war. And of course, I find it as disappointing as you are, because the way I see it, I think Israel is, again, sticking to the law as much as it could, but at the same time, the same standards is being used against it. So yeah, my question would be, how can the Israeli military adhere to international law when at the same time is being used against it?
It's the trickiest question of all, I think, because all Western democracies are really struggling with this. And, uh, there are clear laws of engagement. Okay, rules of engagement say you can't target civilian population. And so to evacuate civilians from war zone to safe zone, they issued, and we have all the stats in our website, millions of SMS messages and pamphlets and calls. There are actually calls that are published of Shin Bet coordinators. These are usually Bedouin or Israeli Arab who speak fluent Arabic in the Gaza dialect, who speak to local Gazans and say, Ya akhi, my brother, you have to evacuate. And then they tell them how much they hate Hamas and so on. This is amazing piece of evidence. And so they order them to leave into safe zones. They establish tent cities. It costs a lot of money, and let trucks in through the Kerem Shalom and the Rafah crossing. Um, once that's done, you have, of course, airstrikes against targets, and then ground forces come. So had Israel only wanted to, quote unquote, flatten Gaza, like they accuse it to do, it would have been easy to conclude the whole thing without risking soldier lives. Just this morning, we had the very, very tragic announcement of another 4 soldiers who fell in Rafah in Gaza. So the Israeli society does not need to be lectured on the price of war. Soldiers who are the sons and daughters of everyone we know here are risking their lives in order to fight Hamas terrorists. And they are being trapped and they are being ambushed. And they go through the most complicated urban setting you can imagine. One of the soldiers told me about, for example, a doll who was added with a JBL speaker underneath the rubble in one of the buildings they visited, and there was rubble, probably because of airstrikes, and there was a crying baby sound. And when they approach, you can see how it's JBL and how it's a speaker with a baby cry recording and not a real crying baby. And of course, it's attached to a bomb, an IED, an improvised explosive device. So you start getting the sense that these soldiers are fighting in the most impossible conditions, and they are still attempting to avoid civilian casualties. In another case, there was a big Hamas militant who was surrounding himself with women and children on the rooftop of a school, and then IDF snipers were waiting for the opportune moment to strike him, and then he fell, and all the women and children around him screamed and left, but they were left unhurt and unscathed. It would be very easy to just bombard the school, but in fact, the matter that it didn't happen. So it really contradicts a lot of the hysteria and the hot steam around. Had Israel done something very terrible, I would not have defended it but I know the system and I'm part of the system and I know it. And it's not who we are. So and my only advice is for people not to fall for the United Nations reports. They are biased anyway. The UN Secretary General seems to have an Israel problem, and an obsession with us, and many other news outlets who are quoting the Gaza Ministry of Health, so-called. I think we should definitely look at the heroism of Israeli troops and focus on simply assuring that Gaza never again becomes a terrorist hub.
Yes. Because of the mandatory service laws, at least when it applies to Jews and Druze and Circassians, um, anyone who is part of the IDF is someone that is a son, a daughter, an uncle, a father of everyone else. And of course, being a reservist, you wear both boots, so to speak, you as a civilian as well as a military member. So it can be very difficult, I think, that challenge to either evaluate the value of, say, of the life of an IDF soldier with that of, say, a Gazan civilian. And and it is true that the standard by which Israel is operating on is near to impossible. How can we secure both of these lives at the same time? Um, and that brings me to another difficulty that the IDF may encounter, and that is the battleground and is urban, is dense, and there are instances of terrorists and militants of Gaza seizing civilian buildings like schools and hospitals and so on. Um, Perhaps even not without not uh, with the without the knowledge of the residents who live there. And it's yeah, it's quite difficult. And I think
So
after this, I think a course in like military studies can be produced about how the IDF operates itself, not just in this war, but throughout history. Um, Yeah, I'm reminded of this quotation by Prime Minister Mayer. Peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us. Now, I think decades has passed by since Prime Minister Mayer said that, and there are a few Arabs who, have decided such and have made peace with Israel. I'm sure the rest of the Arab world will follow eventually. But I think when you replace
uh,
the phrase Arabs with Hamas or Gaza, it is clear that their hatred of Israel triumphs over their love of, I suppose, their own people. How do you reckon with that ideology that seemingly possesses them to do so?
Look, the Arab world is intricate and it is complex, and many people in the West who feign to be Orientalists and commanding these, very anthropological studies, especially in the colonial period prior to 1948, were talking about the people of the region as if they were, a nice. I'm very sorry to say, it's a very rude thing to say, but it's if they were in a zoo, right? They were sort of studying the species there and professing to write entire books, and none of them was really getting to the point because I think the Arab world is very traditional, it's very conservative, and it is teeming with belief. The center, the cornerstone of Islam is Mecca and Medina. Arab people who are usually bringing many, many children. It is a testimony to people who have a very strong survival instinct, a tough life in the desert, and you can tell how belief in Islam is an integral part of their lives. And I think we shouldn't try to judge neither them nor us. Okay, even in Israel, I think trying to tell us, for example, that somehow 19 years of illegal Jordanian occupation of the old city of Jerusalem make it historic Palestine. This is ridiculous. This is not history. It's just rubbish. But somehow the United Nations decided that, and so it becomes true. You can't tell people of belief that they are colonizers in their own country. And I think the Arab world has come to terms with, Prime Minister Netanyahu once called it in the United Nations. He said, actually, a month before the massacre in September 2023, he said that there was a quarter century of good intentions, but who led to catastrophic outcomes. That no peace treaty was signed since the Oslo Accords because it was premised any American president and Israeli leader tried to to build up peace on the notion that Israeli did the devastating concessions to the Palestinians and serving the other cheek will basically open that gate to the entire Arab world, and that never happened. So, and then when trying the opposite method in 2020, four peace treaties were signed. It was with four Arab countries, the Gulf countries, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, then Sudan and Morocco. So four countries who agreed to focus on their national interests first, to put their interests first. I'm reminding you that when Egypt in the late 70s concluded a peace accord with Israel, it was banished from the Arab League for 10 years. There was a big uproar about this, and ultimately led to its, it treated like as a pariah state of the Arab world, and the PLO, Palestinians, were attempting to block the Abraham Accords in 2020, and the Arab League never agreed to discuss it. So it is really a major shift, and I think it came in a pinnacle of moment where the Arab world really saw the real danger, which is Iran. So in that sense, Arab leaders were focusing on their national interests. It's not a big love of Zion. They were looking at the big challenge, which is Iran and its nuclear program. Iran that is leading all of the campaign around us with Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, of course, and all these things, and destabilizing these countries in their own homes and in their own domestic arena. And so this is really what it's all about. I mean, Arab countries who are preferring normalizing relations with Israel and not wait forever for the really insistence of the Palestinians.
Okay. Right. Final question, if I may. Yeah, what does victory look like in this scenario?
I think let's divide it into theaters. The Gaza theater, obviously, is the one with the highest military intensity. We have to demolish Hamas entirely, which is the leaders of Hamas killed. The brigades of Hamas cannot function anymore as brigades. The governmental and municipal structures of Hamas do not function anymore. And the IDF has full military control of the entirety of the Gaza Strip, the entirety, no pockets, no Deir el-Balah and Rafah who are pockets, the entirety of Gaza. And they are, once that happens, it leaves a vacuum because there are obviously many Hamas militants in the area, and they will take a couple of years to combat the high intensity mode, and we have to stay there for the long term to make sure that it doesn't resprout. Number two, get the hostages. There are still 120 hostages there. They're illegally kept in horrendous conditions. The four hostages were released in a really heroic cinematic operation, you can call it that, really reflects the heroism and the training and the belief of Israeli troops over there, really with such, spearhead combatants. One of the hostages said he shared a knock on the door and the soldiers were there after 8 months. Imagine that. 8 months in captivity, and the soldier says it's the IDF who came to rescue you. And it's unbelievable. And but not all of them can, well, I don't know if all of them can be retrieved this way right now. And I think Hamas has to be eliminated, the hostages be released in any way possible that is reasonable and meeting the goals of the war, and not stopping the war, just a temporary truce. If that's required. If not required, let's just put military pressure and until all hostages are released. And then heralding a new reality in Gaza. So the Gaza Strip can no longer be a terrorist hub. That's what President Biden and his team failed to understand. Israelis are no longer willing to be victims. So we are not going to another war in Gaza. This will be the last Gaza war. And when President Biden deal says that we should evacuate all IDF troops from Gaza because, quote, Hamas, I don't believe at this point can execute another October 7, they do not get it. We don't, and he says, I will always keep support Israel's right to defend itself, and I keep providing it with Iron Dome. Fundamental misunderstanding. Israel is not going back to October 6th with Iron Dome and passive defense against rockets and tunnels. It's not going to happen anymore. Israel will forever control the Gaza Strip in terms of military control and freedom of operation. But local Palestinians gradually will sprout once Hamas is defeated and will take leadership over their own communities. That's what I want to see here. Um, Palestinians have proven themselves incapable of governing. Neither the Palestinian Authority, who is a terrorist organization masked in suits, nor Hamas prove that they are capable of fighting terrorism. And indeed, they are the generators of terrorism. And so that's what I'd like to see in Gaza. The real challenge, the real next challenge is the North. And we haven't spoken about Hezbollah, but it is going to, in my opinion, either explode or some sort of miracle will happen. But the Northern Front, I'm not optimistic about it at all. And Hezbollah is a major Iranian proxy and a guerrilla group that is controlling Lebanon and is harassing Israel with hundreds of rockets and even thousands of attacks ever since October 7. You got all the other militias in the area. We're not going to deal with them in the coming period of time, I believe. But there is also Iran. That's where I like to conclude. I think Iran is the big generator of instability in the Middle East. You cannot fight Hamas, win the battle and lose the war. So Hamas is an Iranian tentacle, and the United States, if it were wise, it would have long ago constructed a coalition in the Middle East, led by the United States, with Israel and Arab states, expand the Arab Accords, build an American-Israeli Arab coalition against Iran to tackle its nuclear program and its ballistic missile program, and all these things that really are putting the Middle East in danger. And they're investing tens of billions of dollars per year, the Iranians, in building this infrastructure of terrorism. And this is where the water drops, as they say. This is the tap, and we have to close the tap. The whole Middle East is suffering because of the Iranian regime. And what the West is focusing on is what kind of precaution measures Israeli soldiers take in Gaza. This is not the main issue here. The main issue is Iran and its state-sponsored terrorism. So I think really it's time for the West. It's a time of reckoning. It is time for the Western world to know the real enemy, which is Russia, China, and Iran, the Axis. Hamas is just a tentacle, just a proxy. Face the big challenges. And it is only a matter of political will because the ability exists in the West. I think it is the only way that not only Israel can win, but the West can win.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, or Yissachar,
Thank you so
for
much.
joining the show.